Welcome back, brothers, to Lore Amber. Tonight we're diving into the same lore and theory on who's behind the King of Yellow. Before we get into that, be sure to like and comment any videos and topics you want to see in the future. Be sure to subscribe for the Emperor. I want to thank you guys for support. I've been killing it. Be sure to check out the merch in the description below. Now, let's get into the video.
The quills of the automatums scratch like a chorus of insects in the half-dark, tallying my words even as the air in this vault stales and curdles. I have ordered the lumen globes to a low burn, just enough to draw a sickly glow from the dust that hangs in the air like powdered bone. It is the color of old parchment and dried fat, a faded, unhealthy yellow that clings to everything it touches. It is a fitting light in which to commit heresy. My name has been chiseled from the plinths of the Ordo. The sigils that once hung from my neck have been consigned to plasma and ash. I am, by decree of the Lords of Terror, lost in action, devoured by an empiric storm above some nameless, burning world. In truth, I sit here still, hunched amid the dead air of a forgotten archive, and the only storm that gnaws at me is the weight of what I have learned. I have hunted demons for longer than most men are allowed to live. I have stood beneath skies that bled. I have watched reality sag and tear, like wet flesh under the claws of things that should never have names. I have seen whole regiments fed into the maws of warp-spawned monstrosities, and heard the laughter of thirsting gods echo down vox channels, thick with static and screams. These horrors trouble my sleep less than a pattern I can no longer ignore, a silence too careful to be accidental. It is not the silence around the Emperor. The catechisms admit that his voice is stilled, that his will is now expressed through the fumbling consensus of his servants. No, this is a different absence, a wrongness at the very heart of our recorded glory, a gap with a shape. Constantin Valdor, the Captain General of the Legio Custodes, walks beside the Master of Mankind through the annals of unification and the Great Crusade as a golden shadow. No picturama, no fresco, no sanctioned hollow of those days is complete without that tall, helmed figure at the Emperor's right hand, auramite armor blazing like a shard of captured sun. The catechismals for the scholar children speak of him as the Emperor's peerless guardian, first to advance, last to retreat. The Remembrancer epics cast him as the golden executioner, the silent angel of judgment whose coming meant that a war was already decided. And then, somewhere in the deep wars of the heresy and the long misery that followed, he is not there anymore. The Primarchs burn and fall and fly apart. Each is given a destiny, be it martyrdom, damnation, exile, or apotheosis. Their fates are sung, argued, codified, until each is a pillar of myth. Valdor, whose hand rested closer to the Emperor's throne than that of any Primarch, whose authority in the palace and in the inner chambers eclipsed that of almost every Lord of Terror, simply steps away from the page. The tales of triumphs and tragedies roll on without him. The gilded shadow vanishes, and in its place the record is mute. The adepts of the Administratum will tell you that such absences are natural. They speak of lost tomes, of data corrupted by age or by warp storms, of scribes who simply did not deem a given detail worthy of costly ink. They will gesture with ink-stained hands to whole shelves reduced to warped slag by enemy action or foolishness. The servants of the Ordo will add that there are reasons for silence, that some truths are too dangerous to set down where the weak of faith might stumble upon them. I have nodded along to such explanations more times than I care to count. But I am Ordo Malleus. My trade is patterns, and I have seen too many demonic cults laid bare not to recognize one when I see its shape in the world. There is a difference between a broken floor and a deliberate pit. What follows is speculation. It must be. The Imperium's history is not a clear road marked by milestones and dates. It is more like a shattered fresco, some pieces bright and pristine, because they hang in every chapel and training hall, others scorched and half melted where only. Archivists ever see them? Others ground under heel and lost in the dust. To pretend you can sweep the shards into neat lines and call that a continuous story is a comforting lie for scholar masters and parade preachers. I have sat with those shards for decades. I have traced thumb-smoothed lines in volumes that once belonged to remembrancers who died when the vengeful spirit fell from the sky. I have bribed and threatened mechanicus savants for access to corrupted data slates dredged from the flooded basements of administratum hives. I have listened to dying Astartes gasp out memories of unification in voices charred by plasma and phlegm and their own blood. None of it matches cleanly. Events contradict one another. Heroes die twice in two different theaters of war. Whole cities are both destroyed and spared in overlapping accounts. The truth of this age, if truth it can be called, lives in the echo between stories. The pattern that haunts me lives there too, in the Golden Age. Before the heresy, when the master of mankind walked abroad and his word was a living thing and not the varnished decree of a conclave, Valdor was more than a bodyguard. Only fools believed that the captain general of the Legio Custodes was a glorified household servant. On the blood-soaked plains of old Knight's last days, when the emperor put warlords to the sword and broke science covens over his knee, it was Valdor who led the golden phalanxes. The Primarchs were weapons hurled outward, burning across the stars. Valdor was the hand that threw them, and the blade that guarded the heart of terror itself. He was not a Primarch. He did not own a legion. He had no gene sons whose deeds would echo his name through the millennia. Yet in every account that touches the inner workings of the palace, in every vision of the War Master's treachery that draws close to the Sanctum Imperialis, Valdor stands upon the threshold as a fixed point. Others rage and betray and fall to darkness. He alone remains utterly, fanatically devoted to the will of his master. There is a word for a man who stands forever at the right hand of a ruler, who commands elites that do not answer to any lord or council, who enforces judgment with his own blade and answers only to a throne. Regent. Not in title, of course. The Imperium has had its regents, and their names are carved in stone and recorded in shrines and councils. Malcador, the Sigillite, wore that burden famously for a short and terrible span. Later High Lords have wrapped it about themselves with varying degrees of honesty and competence, yet through all their pomp there stands that other figure, armor like liquid gold, helm like a sculpted death mask, whose duty begins where any mortal regent's ends. Valdor is the Emperor's Shadow King, the crownless monarch who rules only through war. I write these words in a room lit by lumen globes of tarnished brass. Their light is not the clean white blaze of a sanctified chapel. It is a dim, jaundiced glow that throws long, twisted silhouettes across the stacked tomes and rusting cogitator banks. It reminds me of another light entirely, a memory I cannot prove is my own. Perhaps I dreamed it. Perhaps it bled from the minds of others into mine via the warp, as thoughts sometimes do when one walks too long by the edge of madness. In that memory, I stand at the edge of a vault where the walls are not walls at all but plates of polished gold, each engraved with the names of the fallen. The air tastes of dust and incense, undercut by the metallic taint of old blood. Statues line the hall, towering, inhumanly perfect figures in auramite plate, each one painted and gilded so that not a finger breadth of bare metal shows. The light that falls from the high vaults is the same as the walls, the same as the armor, so that the whole space seems poured from molten gold. The Imperium loves gold. It smothers itself in it. The golden throne, the gilded lord, the light of terror. Every devotional scroll, every shrine wall, every pageantry of the Adeptus Ministorum drowns the eye in auric radiance. Gold is purity, is perfection, is glory hammered into a metal that does not rust. But gold does not stay gold forever. On a corpse world, where I once hounded the remnants of a heretic host, I saw an ancient shrine whose doors had been sealed since the Great Crusade. When we burned those doors away, we found statues inside, clad in what had once been auramite, and was now a blotched, ugly yellow, streaked with greens and browns where chemical fumes had eaten at the surface. It was still metal, it still gleamed in places, but the shine no longer spoke of glory, it spoke of sickness, of something once magnificent now left too long to rot. In the scriptures and monuments of the Imperium, the language is always gold, always light. In the mutterings of madmen and the theatre of heretics, that gold takes on a different hue, yellow, sallow, diseased. The difference is slight, to the eye, but to the soul, it reeks. Gold is the color of the emperor's brilliance. Yellow is the color of a candle guttering in a room where something unseen breathes at your back. Throughout my trawling of apocryphal texts, one figure recurs. A king in yellowed armor, a monarch whose cloak was once imperial gold, now faded and stained, whose crown is not a circlet, but a halo of unhealthy light. He is not named. He is called only the King in Yellow, and he walks the ruined halls of a palace that could only be on terror, dispensing a justice so cold that even the damned beg for mercy. Comforting lies have a way of rotting into their opposites. I have stood before memorial walls raised to the era of ruin, those first soul-shocking centuries after the heresy, when the Imperium staggered like a drunken giant through its own wreckage. On one such slab of stone in a shrine hall of Ultima Segmentum, a verse had been chiseled so smooth by the touch of pilgrims that only fragments remained. It spoke of how the fallen rest in honor, of how the price paid in blood was terrible, but worth the salvation of mankind. The pilgrim guides recited it with wet eyes and shaking voices, proud of their suffering. The servitor that cleaned the floor below that slab slopped its grey water in the same groove every day. The runnel of filth had eaten through the names of several entire regiments. That is the Imperium. Pious words carved in stone, while its own waste dissolves the truth beneath. The King in Yellow, I have come to believe, is not some foreign demon who has crept into our narrative from outside. He is what happens to the myth of perfect golden justice when you pour too much blood over it and pretend that the stench is incense. He is gold turned rancid. If such a thing were to take shape from a man, then the crucible that would shape him is the era of ruin. The sanctioned histories leap from the siege to the scouring, with the same ease a mendicant priest leaps. From a tale of sin to a hymn of forgiveness. There is betrayal, there is fire, there is the traitor war master's fall. Then there is the scouring, righteous and terrible, the faithful driving the apostate before them, purging the stars. Between those thunderclaps lies a silence that, if you listen closely, is not silence at all, but the hiss of a galaxy bleeding out. We have names for that span, the era of ruin, the time of woe, the long ash. None of those names come with neat ledgers of battles and dates. They come with stories of worlds half rebuilt and then smashed again by roving war bands, of god machines without masters, trampling cities into grey paste, because no one remembered the right litanies to make them kneel. They come with images of terror itself, choked in dust, the oceans poisoned, the sky thick with soot from burning starships. The imperial palace not yet the ossified fortress shrine it would become, but a wounded animal, bleeding incense and void shields and prayers. If there was ever a moment when the man called Constantin Valdor might crack, might metamorphose, it would be then, alone in the half-light of a throne room where a god no longer moved, surrounded by echoes of betrayal, with all that he had killed and all that he had protected reduced to rubble. How do I know any of this? I do not. Not as the Scholars demand. I have no neat parchment labeled with a date and a seal and a confession signed in blood. My method is uglier, more akin to the work of a corpse thief than a historian. I steal fragments, a marginal note in a devotional illuminated for some noble line on a backwater agri-world, in which the scribe sketches a royal figure in yellowed armor kneeling before the throne, a corrupted scrap of noospheric data from a Mechanicus relay, carrying a half-intelligible Vox report of a golden warrior stalking the sub-levels beneath the palace in the early days of the Scouring. A play banned and burned by the earliest Ordo agents, whose few surviving lines speak of a nameless king whose judgment drives men to madness. A campaign chronicle from a Space Marine chapter that makes an offhand reference to receiving silent guidance from a custodian whose name is lost, but whose description fits no recorded warrior. None of these fragments agree on the small things. Heights, voices, weapons, even the number of those present will all shift and warp as they pass from source to source. That is the nature of history under the shadow of the warp. There is what the Imperium records, there is what its enemies remember, and there is what the Immaterium reflects back at us like a funhouse mirror. And yet, through that distortion, a pattern remains. We are told that the Emperor is master of mankind. The statues carve his titles in stone. The sermons add more with every generation, until his list of honorifics is longer than the lives of those who recite them. We are told that he rules eternally from the Golden Throne, where, in any of those records, is the coronation. Search as I might, I find none. There are descriptions of his victories, of his deeds, of his wisdom. There are hagiographies that speak of his divinity with the conviction of zealots and the vagueness of madmen. There are endless images of him seated on the throne, wreathed in radiance, adored by saints and psychers alike. But there is no account of the day on which he accepted that crown. No chronicle of a ceremony where he laid aside the trappings of mortal generalship and allowed himself to be made into a god in truth, and not just in the hysteria of his followers. The closest any text comes is in ritual metaphors, the emperor enthroned as the final act in the tragedy of the heresy. There is the fall of the arch-traitor. There is the mortal wounding of the master of mankind. There is the desperate act of sealing him within the throne to hold back the tides of unreality. The conclusion is described with awe and tears and incense, but it is never told as an enthronement. It is told as a sacrifice. The sacrifice does not rule. The sacrifice is the nail that pins reality in place. Someone else must swing the hammer. The High Lords will tell you that they rule, that they interpret the will of terror, that their counsels shape the destiny of the species. They speak loudly in their chambers and believe their own echoes. Outside those walls, men and women are crushed in their billions beneath wars and tithes whose logic they will never see, while the throne chamber above them hums and burns and drinks psyker souls like water. Who, then, is king? In all the tumult of those early years, when the palace still stank of burning gene seed and the statues were still being rebuilt, only one figure stood every day at the side of that silent body upon the throne. Only one warrior had both the authority and the will to act directly in the emperor's stead, to judge lives and worlds with a gesture, and yet the records fall silent about him, just as that role would be most needed. Valdor's deeds fall away after the siege, as if someone had taken a blade to the parchment and excised him. His name is spoken of as something in the past tense, if at all, even in records that reach into the first movements of the Scouring. The Legio Custodes are mentioned, patrolling the palace, guarding the webway breach, standing vigil at the Golden Throne, but their Captain General becomes a ghost, a title that no one is shown to wear, a crown whose wearer is never depicted, is not a missing detail. It is a shadow. Thus I come at last to the forbidden sentence that has driven me into exile and obscurity, that has turned my colleagues into hunters and my former acolytes into bait. Constantin Valdor, the Emperor's golden regent, did not simply die, nor did he retire to some silent cloister to polish relics and wait for the end of time. He became something else. He became what happens when endless duty and proximity to godhood are poured into a vessel already fractured by betrayal and war. He became the rotted reflection of the golden myths, the jaundiced, sickly echo that walks the halls after the glorious statues have been toppled. The king in yellow is no new demon, no foreign invader in our story. He is Constantin Valdor, as seen through the lens of the era of ruin, after his gold turned sour. This work will not prove that claim beyond all doubt. Nothing in this age can. The warp itself breathes upon our records, smearing and distorting as it pleases. What I can do is lay out the trail of symbols and stories that lead always back to that golden shadow, and show how, step by faltering step, they darken from auric brilliance to the diseased yellow of a bruise. In the pages to come, I will trace how a half-ruined Aquila, a banned drama, and a pattern of silences all point to a single, terrible metamorphosis. I will show where the gold was laid, how it was cracked and what crawled out from beneath the gilding when the light went out. You may decide that I am mad. Perhaps I am. Perhaps the long years of peering into the abyss of the warp have filled my mind with phantoms and made me see kings where there are only corpses. Or perhaps, as with every demon cult I have ever unmasked, the very enormity of the truth is what makes it so easy to dismiss. Either way, I have set the first piece of the puzzle before you. Look at it long enough, and you may start to see the shape that waits in the gaps. In the end, every argument that I will lay before you comes back to a single image, one that I did not see with my own eyes, yet which I can no longer dislodge from my thoughts. It has crept into my dreams, into my waking reveries as I sit hunched amid dust and failing lumen light. It is a reconstruction built from testimonies, from remembrance of sketches, from the jagged edge of memory that has survived through other men's words and my own unhealthy imagination. The sky above Old Terra was a bruise. Clouds boiled in colors that had no place in clean air, smears of chem and rad fallout rolling like sluggish oceans across continents that had been ground into battlefield and grave. The fortress that squatted on the basalt plain had once been a mountain, until the techno-barbarians had hollowed it and plated it in scrap metal and scavenged voidship hull. Its towers were chimneys vomiting black smoke. Its walls were teeth bristling with macro-cannon mouths, their barrels rimed in soot and rust. They had resisted the lightning bearers. They had bled the proto-legiones in the trenches before their gates, trading gene-crafted flesh for rad-scarred stone and poisoned air. They had thrown their warp-twisted weaponry and their half-understood relic guns into the sky and killed dropships as they screamed in. They had carved out a reputation in the unification campaigns as a fortress that ate heroes. Then the Emperor turned his gaze upon that bastion and sent not a legion, but his household. There is a fragment from a remembrancer's journal that survived as a micro-etched inscription on the inside of a locket. The locket was prized from the ribs of a dead iterator centuries later, then scavenged by a Mechanicus expedition and filed without care in a bin of curiosities until I found it. The script is shaky, cut by a hand still shaking from retroactively imposed fear. They came in a line of gold, it reads. They walked through the rad dust as if it were incense. The shells that struck them screamed and died on their armor. They did not run. They advanced at the pace of a funeral march. The custodes did not hurry. They did not need to. Their shields locked together in a wall that turned energy beams aside and drank the fury of mass-reactive shells. Where splinters of superheated metal and stone rebounded, they sliced mortal men apart in ragged sheets, flensing faces from skulls, ripping limbs from bodies in bloody sprays that painted the irradiated, dust in fresh, wet color, the air filled with the stink of scorched flesh and burnt propellant, with the shrilling animal keen of the fortress guns as their machine spirits spat rage and fear. Ahead of that advancing wall walked one figure whose presence those who survived could not fully articulate. He carried a guardian spear whose blade flashed in the murk with the clean light of a dying star. His helm was wrought in the image of an angel, expressionless, impassive. His cloak snapped in the polluted wind, its weight dragging a furrow through the ash and bone. Where the enemy guns found him, the rounds screamed apart, as if ashamed to mar that aura might hide. Where his spear struck, things died. They called him the Golden Reaper. The fortress gates were slabs of composite and stolen hull metal meters thick, layered with fields and warding sigils drawn from a dozen perverted tech cults. They had held against the bombardment of legions, had laughed off the fury of artillery. The Golden Reaper approached them alone, while the custodian phalanx locked shields and took a knee in the dust, their heads bowed like an honor guard. He set the butt of his spear upon the ground. He raised his free hand to the gates. He spoke a word that no survivor could repeat. The Vox records from that day reduced that sound to a shriek of static and a burst of skull-splitting feedback. The planet itself seemed to hold its breath. The gates turned black, not scorched, not melted, but suddenly and entirely consumed, collapsing into powder as a heatless wave passed through them. The shock of their fall raised a storm of grit and metal fragments. Skulls, long since fused into the scrap by prior bombardments, were jarred loose and rolled down the rubble like a rain of bone dice. When the dust cleared, the Golden Reaper walked into the fortress, and the custodies followed, and the techno-barbarians died by the hundreds and the thousands. The remembrancer, whose hand carved that locket, did not see what happened within those walls. No mortal reporter was allowed to walk in the wake of the Emperor's household that day. The accounts that speak of the interior slaughter are second-hand, third-hand, snatched from the mouths of dying warriors, or culled from the broken gibbering of barbarians who fled and were later taken. They all agree on one point. Nothing lived where the guardian spear passed. Men were reduced to charred ruin, their armor fused into their flesh, their skulls burst like overripe fruit by blows that shattered bone and brains together. Ranks of cyber-augmented brutes were cut apart in single sweeping strikes that carved limbs from torsos and left headless bodies stumbling a few paces before collapsing in sprays of blood and offal. Servo skulls found the aftermath days later, when the air cooled enough for lesser men to enter, and their picked captures show chambers ankle-deep in slurry, where flesh and ash and melted metal had mingled. This was not the work of a guard. This was the work of a headsman. The master of mankind had judged that fortress unworthy of parley, unworthy even of the theatrical diplomacy he sometimes extended to stubborn warlords. He had sent Valdor to enact the sentence. The catechisms call the Captain General the first of the Emperor's 10,000. They speak of him as the paragon of the custodes ideal, as if he were simply the captain of an elite guard. The truths that seep between those hymns tell another story. When his armies marched, the Emperor hurled primarchs and legions at the walls of recalcitrant empires. When he desired a thing ended, when he wanted a warlord erased or a citadel reduced to memory and dust, he sent Constantin Valdor. There is debate among those few who are permitted to debate such things over where exactly Valdor sits on the ladder of power. The Astartes are gene-wrought soldiers, crafted from the best of baseline humanity and swollen to monstrous size by organ graft and chem ritual. The Primarchs are something else entirely, phoenixes risen from the cauldron of the Emperor's own genius, each a living weapon and a demigod. The Custodes stand between these castes, not mass-produced as the legions were, but individually made, each one a singular work that cannot be easily repeated. Valdor stands even among those giants as an anomaly. The scraps of laboratory record that the more heretical magi whisper about speak of calibrations that were later deemed uneconomical, of gene batches so exactingly wrought that they could not be replicated on a large scale. It is said that the forging of Constantin Valdor required a level of attention that only one being in creation could have furnished, and that every part of his making was touched directly by the hand and will of the emperor. Whether these whispers are truth or fevered myth, the fact remains that no other custodian ever commanded as much trust or as much latitude as the Captain General. He moved through the war councils of the Great Crusade with the same silent certainty with which he crossed battlefields. Primarchs shouted, argued, boasted. They crowded around holomaps like brightly armored wolves, their voices rising, their tempers flaring. The remembrancer picts that survive show Valdor standing apart, helm under one arm, his expression unreadable. When the emperor spoke, he listened. When the Primarchs spoke, he listened. When he chose to speak himself, those Primarchs fell silent. He was not given a legion. He commanded no gene sons who bore his name and his features into glory and damnation. He was never carved as a towering statue over a fortress monastery gate. There are no chapters that paint his sigils upon their armor. It is a glaring absence. To fashion such a being, honed beyond even the standards of his already terrifying peers, and then to deny him the outward trappings of command that were showered upon the Primarchs, speaks of intent. Why was he never crowned? The easy answer is obedience. The emperor desired a perfect servant, so he made one. A weapon without independent ambition, a blade that could be wielded without fear of it turning in the hand. It is an answer that comforts those who repeat it. It makes the universe tidier. It is also an answer that rings false when laid against the patchwork record. There are moments, scattered through the accounts of that age, where Valdor's obedience shows seams. One such instance surfaces in the journals of a Terran warlord brought into compliance late in the unification. Before his execution, he was permitted to dictate his version of events. It was meant as a cautionary tale. In one passage, he recalls a parley in a dust-blasted amphitheater, the emperor seated upon a makeshift throne, his custodes arrayed about him. The warlord describes voicing terms that the emperor rejects. He speaks of feeling the gaze of the master of mankind settle upon him like the weight of a world. He also recalls, in a shaken aside, that before the emperor responded, the golden warrior at his right hand shifted, the faintest movement of helm. Their eyes met, and for a heartbeat, the warlord saw something like both pity and condemnation there. The terms he had offered would not have pleased the techno-cults whose backing he relied upon, but they would have spared many of his tribes. Valdor, it seems, knew this. When the emperor decreed that there would be no terms, that the tribes would be broken entirely, it is recorded that Valdor hesitated, his spear point dipping fractionally, before he raised it and signaled the advance. Elsewhere, in the careful anecdotes of remembrancers who followed the Great Crusade at a safer distance, there are hints of decisions made without explicit sanction. Expeditions diverted to annihilate enclaves that technically lay outside the prescribed borders of compliance zones. Worlds scoured of dubious gene cults before they could be assessed, their records afterwards, tagged with the sigil of the Captain General. These are not the actions of an automaton. They are the choices of a man who weighs consequences and acts according to a standard that is his own, even when it bends or preempts the spoken will of his master. A king who must act in the name of another is still a king. He only wears a mask over his crown. If Malcador the Sigillite was the empire's grey-robed regent, then Valdor was the blade in the dark that made that regency more than words. The histories, such as they are, present Malcador as the emperor's voice in his absence, the administrator who sat the lion throne in the hall of Leng and signed orders that sent whole sectors to war or to death. He is shown poring over scrolls, convening councils, carving the bureaucratic skeleton of an imperium that would outlast its founder's living flesh. Valdor is shown less often in those accounts, but when he appears, it is always at the edges of such scenes watching, a tall shape in gold behind the sigillite's throne, a flash of auramite in a shadowed doorway as orders are relayed. The two of them are not equals in any formal sense, yet in practice they define the limits of one another's power. Malcador can decree, but without the threat of that golden executioner, his decrees would be so much ink. Valdor can kill, but without the sigillite's nets of law and record, his killings would be isolated acts. They are the twin poles of Imperium beneath the master of mankind. One is parchment and seal and softly spoken threat. One is spear point and execution block and the certainty of a clean beheading. Together they are what we would call a regency, if the Imperium were honest with itself. It is instructive to consider the Legio Custodes themselves, for they are not a legion in the way the Astartes are legions. They do not recruit en masse from the teeming herds of humanity. They do not conquer worlds and paint their banners upon star maps. They are the Emperor's household, and their functions run deeper than a mere battlefield roster list would suggest. They stand at the doors of his inner sancta, but they also bear his messages into council, act as his envoys, serve as his champions in duels of honor and in executions too significant to be entrusted to lesser blades. They attend him in ritual, acting as chamberlains and masters of the sacred protocol that surrounds his presence. In the early days of the Great Crusade, foreign rulers brought in chains spoke of being received with a formality that mirrored ancient Terran courts, their introductions announced by custodian voices, their fate weighed under custodian gaze. Valdor sat at the head of that household. He was, in every fashion that matters, the lord of a court whose king walked more often in the immaterium than in the material world, even before the throne swallowed him. Then came the siege. Other monographs have painted that nightmare in detail. I will not dwell overlong on what is already etched into the nightmares of every loyal servant who has ever learned the truth of that time. I will confine myself to the corridor where, by cross-reference of data and survivor accounts, I can place the Captain General with some confidence. The walls are cracked marble streaked with soot. Once they were hung with banners embroidered with the sigils of legions and victories. Now those banners hang in tatters or lie in blackened heaps on the floor, soaked in blood that has dried to dark rust. The air is thick with ash. It drifts in slow eddies, disturbed by the heavy tread of armored boots. In some sections, the ash piles knee-deep, shot through with fragments of bone, with ceramite splinters, with the slick, cooled dribbles of once molten adamantium. Each step grinds down skulls already cracked by shell bursts or crushed under the tracks of war machines. Valdor walks through this ruin. His armor is no longer the untouched auramite of the propaganda. Picts. It is streaked in black where fire has kissed it, daubed in brown where blood has dried and flaked. In some places the gilding has been scoured away, leaving the raw metal beneath exposed and dull. His cloak is torn, the hem is heavy with ash, and the clotted remnants of brain and bone from foes struck down at close quarters. There are dents in his breastplate, where traitor rounds hammered home, shallow marks that suggest not invulnerability, but endurance. Around him lie the dead. Here a custodian, helm split, face within pulverized empty sockets, staring at a ceiling that no longer exists. There a lunar wolf, armor hacked open at the gorget, throat torn out by a blow that took half the spinal column with it, a ragged tunnel of meat and shattered vertebrae. There a world eater, the red of his plate indistinguishable from the coating of gore and entrails that hangs in strips from his pauldrons, his chest crushed inward by a strike that drove ribs through lungs and heart and came out the other side. Loyalist and traitor, Their blood runs together in long, slow channels down the corridor, pooling in hollows, soaking into cracked stone. Valdor walks amid them, and he is the one who is still on his feet. This is the load that rests upon his shoulders when the Emperor falls. He has watched gods go to war and tear one another apart. He has stood in chambers where Primarchs screamed out their father's name in rage, in betrayal, in grief. He has killed men whose names will echo in curses and prayers for as long as the Imperium limps on. He has seen the walls of the palace, once gleaming and perfect, reduced to cracked bone, pitted by fire and claw marks that go deeper than stone. When the battle ends and the master of mankind is bound, screaming into the golden throne, when Malcador is dust, when the war master is ash, and the traitor legions flee into the dark, who is left who can stand before that charnel machine and not be driven mad by the enormity of what it has become? The High Lords who emerge in the years that follow are administrators, generals, fabricator lords, petty tyrants, and necessary monsters. They rule in the way that men rule, through councils and tithes and decrees. They cannot go near the throne. Their bodies would crumple, their souls would tear. They rule the echo of an empire, not its blazing heart. Valdor and his 10,000 stand where they cannot. Day after day, year after year, uncounted centuries of vigil in a hall where the air is thick with the coppery stink of blood and the upholstery is made of screaming souls. The light in that chamber is gold. Every hymn, every statue carved, every devotional mural insists that it is gold. Yet there are apocryphal accounts, muttered by psychers whose leashes slipped for a moment, that speak of that light as something else. They call it jaundiced. They call it the hue of old bruises, of pus, of parchment, left too long in damp air. There is a difference between gold and yellow, as I wrote before. To the untrained eye, they may blur together. To those who walk in that light day after day, who feel it seep into their pores, into the seams of their armor, into the fibers of their cloaks, the distinction becomes very real. Endless proximity to that light stains. Look at the records for the era of ruin and the early scouring. You will find tales of Primarchs leading punitive crusades, of chapter masters carving out bastions amid the ruins of the old Imperium, of high lords wrestling over scraps of authority. You will find the names of saints and heretics, of renegade war masters and loyal commanders. You will find surprisingly few instances of the name Constantin Valdor. It is not that the custodes vanish entirely from the page. They are mentioned in passing, as custodians of the webway breach, as guards upon the palace gates, as occasional participants in dire, last resort actions. But their Captain General is a title without an owner. In some archives he is listed as missing, in others as presumed slain in the siege. In yet others the name does not appear at all, as if it had been neatly excised. I have seen marginal notes in administratum hands that refer obliquely to a directive of silence concerning the deeds of the Captain General in the years following the heresy. I have seen fragments of Custodes' internal litanies, redacted so heavily that only the pronoun remains where the name once stood. These are not the chaotic losses of time and entropy. They are careful cuts. Why would they be made, unless what Valdor became in those years was something the Imperium could not comfortably name? I return again to that image I cannot shake. The reluctant coronation that no hymn admits took place. The throne hall is a ruin hastily patched. The vaults above have been shored with adamantium ribs to replace stone cracked by bombardment. The walls are raw, their devotional friezes blasted away, their new surfaces still stained with smoke. The golden throne itself, that monstrous life engine and warp dam, sits at the far end of the hall like the carcass of some titanic predator nailed to the wall. Upon it, the Emperor sits, or what is left of him sits. His eyes are closed, His flesh is a ruin hidden under cables and plates. The machine around him howls and hisses, its pistons pumping, its reservoirs of sacrificial vitae bubbling. The air stinks of burning incense and raw energy, of ozone and cooked meat. Before that abomination, that necessary obscenity, stands a single figure in armor that was once flawless gold. I imagine the light in that hall. It should be brilliant, blinding, a blaze of auric radiance. Instead, it is a harsh, almost sickly glare. It casts no warmth. It paints everything it touches in a tone just off true gold, something a fraction too pale, too flat, too close to the color of aged parchment and old bones. It bleeds across Valdor's plate, crawling over the dents and scorch marks, seeping into the cracks where dried blood has settled. He stands there, the Emperor's crownless king, haloed in yellow light. In that moment, whether he wills it or not, the man forged as the greatest servant in existence takes upon himself a burden that even the Primarchs did not bear. He becomes the only living being who sees the Emperor every day, who breathes the air of that chamber, who hears the machine's heartbeat and the muffled, endless scream of the warp beyond. He becomes the bridge between a dead god and a living empire. He becomes the regent in all but name. If there is a point at which Constantin Valdor ceases to be merely a man, merely a warrior, merely a captain general, and begins to blur into the myth that heretics and madmen will later call the King in Yellow, it is there, in that jaundiced blaze. I did not mean to find it. The sealed vault in which it lay was not on any of the maps the archive servitors slaved to. No line upon their cogitator schemata. No entry in the dusty Codex Logistica stacked in leaning columns around their work pods. It existed as a blank space, and the Imperium teaches that blank spaces are either oversights or warnings. I had lived too long in the shadow of the Ordo not to assume the latter. The door was a slab of plasteel and lead, its surface puckered and pitted where time and neglect had gnawed, but the sigils stamped into it were sharp enough still. The double-headed aquila, its wings spread in stern benediction. The rosette of the Ordo, each petal an eye. Beneath those familiar icons, a single line of script picked out in gold leaf that had tarnished to a dull mustard shade. By decree of the earliest Hereticus conclave, none shall break this seal. There was a time when that would have given me pause. There was a time when the authority of those first witch hunters thrilled me, when the legends of the men who stood in the ashes of the heresy and declared that they would burn every stain out of the Imperium fired my blood. Now, in the half-light of that forgotten isle, the letters looked like what they were. Ink laid down by hands no less fallible than mine, clinging to a certainty that the warp mocks. I spoke the litanies of access anyway. Old habits cling like scars. I whispered codes that no longer appeared in any current lex. I pressed my rosette to the lock plate and felt hidden wards taste its machine spirit. The mechanisms within the door coughed into life, with a sound like a dying man clearing his throat. Seals that had sat unbroken since the early years of the scouring cracked. Dust, thick and yellow and stale, puffed from the gaps and drifted around me in slow motion. Inside, the vault was not a room so much as a coffin. The walls pressed close, lined with shelves that bowed under the weight of data cylinders and parchment scrolls wrapped in rotting leather. The air smelled of old paper, old oil, and that faint metallic tang that speaks of the warp's breath. Lay there, waiting. It was small. It lay there, waiting. It was small, its casing beaten brass chased with thin lines of silver that had dimmed to a dull grey. Someone, long ago, had scratched a warning sigil into its surface with a knife point. The lines were clumsy, the hand hurried. Over that crude mark, a more careful artisan had etched a title in High Gothic. Librum Aurum, the Book of Yellow. I knew that name before I touched it. Whispers of its surface now and then, in the more secret communiques between inquisitors, like the teeth of a corpse rising through quicksand. It is not listed on any official index of heretical works. To speak of it openly is to invite censure. Yet in the same way that the existence of certain demonic cults is never admitted but always assumed, the Librum persists in our private lexicon. An anonymous proto-drama composed in the first miserable centuries after the heresy. A play, of all things, written in the idiom of the wasted age and set in a palace of bones and gold. The earliest hereticus conclaves had discovered it in circulation among battered remnant regiments and starving hive scum on terror itself. They banned it, purged every copy they could find, burned men alive for reciting its lines. They sealed the root data in a vault like this and wrote decrees to warn off their successors. I picked it up. The brass was warm to the touch, as if another hand had just now put it down. My breath misted in the stale air. For a moment I thought I heard another heartbeat under my own, a slow, patient thud that resonated in the bones of my skull. The feeling passed when I slotted the cylinder into the waiting reader's skull and murmured the invocation to wake its spirit. Pale light bled from the reader's oculars, projecting lines of text into the air above the cylinder in hard-edged High Gothic and archaic Terran cant. I dismissed the auto-translate and let the original cadence wash over me. It is important to hear a heresy in its native tongue. The first image the words painted was of a city. It rose upon the edge of a black sea, the waves not water, but tar, heavy and slow, dragging themselves against cyclopean sea walls built from the skulls of titans. The city's foundations were bone, its streets laid in plates of polished gold that reflected a sky clogged with ash. Towers climbed from that gleaming grid at impossible angles, twisting over and under one another, connected by bridges too thin to bear any sane weight. The buildings shifted as the eye followed them. Streets that led in straight lines now curved, now doubled back, now terminated in nothing. Windows moved, doors vanished. The whole city crawled like a living jest. It was, in every respect that mattered, the imperial palace. I have walked those halls. I have looked out from the highest spires over a landscape of shattered hives and scorched fields, and seen the light of the throne burning like a star that never moves. Even after all the reconstruction, the endless rebuilding, the palace bears scars. Walls warped by void shield collapse. Courtyards paved with the fused bone and ceramite of warriors fallen in the siege. Wings closed off with adamantium spar and prayer seals, their interiors too tainted or too unstable for even the custodes to tread. The Librum took that reality and twisted it into theatre. In its pages, the palace is Carcosa, though that name never appears. It is a city that devours those who step within it, its corridors rearranging, its stairways growing and shrinking, its doors opening onto places that should not exist. Men wander for days through its galleries, passing the same statue again and again, each time seeing a new crack, a new smear of dried blood along its base, a new layer of dust creeping over its once perfect face. The throne chamber is never shown entire. It is hinted at, glimpses of machinery behind gauze veils, snatches of golden light bleeding under massive doors like the glow of a forge where flesh is the fuel. At the heart of this nightmare stage walks a king. He is nameless. The script calls him only the King, or the Yellow Lord, or simply he. His armor is described as auric plate gone to rot, once bright gold, now stained and cracked, its pure sheen dulled to the color of old parchment and dried marrow. His cloak trails behind him in heavy folds, the fabric stiff with blood and ash, its original embroidery obscured beneath grime. When he moves, the sound is not the clatter of ceramite or the ring of steel, but a low, continuous scrape, as if the soles of his boots were bone grinding on bone. He carries an axe. The Remembrancer epics favor swords, spears, halberds for their heroes. The Librum's choice is more brutal. The weapon the king wields is a long-shafted thing whose head is a single broad blade etched, with sigils that the dialogue insists are holy and beyond question. Flame burns along that edge, not the roaring red of promethium, but a pale, almost white fire, like the light of a dying sun filtered through fog. Where the axe falls, the script tells us, flesh parts cleanly, bone parts like old wood, and souls scream. The king does not discriminate. The play stages scene after scene of judgment in the ever-shifting halls. Traitor warriors are hauled before him in chains, their armor charred, their eyes wild with chem rage and demonic whispers. Loyal imperial officers are dragged in beside them, uniforms torn, medals clinking, mouths full of protest. The king listens to each plea with the same stillness. Then he passes the same sentence. Guilty. In some scenes he beheads them, the pale fire of the axe leaving a clean line, heads rolling across the gold plates, eyes blinking in baffled outrage before cooling. In others, he drives the blade into their chests and leaves it there, pinning them to walls which are not walls, but screaming faces half submerged in the masonry. In one particularly vicious passage, he orders that both traitor and loyalist be lashed together back to back and thrown from a high balcony, their bodies breaking on statues far below. He never removes his helm. Actors in the drama remark upon it. Servants whisper that the king has no face, that under that mask there is only light, only darkness, only a skull, only a wound. The script delights in such contradictions. At one point, a condemned man babbles that he can see the king's features shifting, now the snarling death mask of a war god, now the calm, angelic visage of a saint as he knew him in better days. The ambiguity is deliberate, a mockery of our need to fix a single image in our minds when confronted with power. Reading those descriptions, it is impossible not to think of Constantin Valdor. The Librum never names him. It does not need to. The mannerisms of the Yellow Lord are drawn with too precise a hand to be coincidence. When he listens to supplicants, he tilts his head by the smallest degree, a gesture recorded elsewhere in battle accounts of the Captain General, as if hearing more than words. When he moves through the halls, he does so without haste, every step measured, the world itself seeming to wait upon his pace. He speaks rarely, and when he does, his words are spare, stripped of flourish. He calls the emperor by titles that match those used in early unification-era litanies, not the more bloated honorifics that accreted in later centuries. He quotes maxims recorded in custodial archives, but never popular devotionals. There is a scene in which the king pauses beside a shattered statue of a Primarch, its stone face seared away by fire. He regards it for a moment, then reaches out and brushes the ash from its chest, revealing the faint outline of a legion's sigil beneath. He says nothing. He moves on. The stage directions note only that his gauntleted hand leaves a smear of something yellow on the stone. It is a small moment, almost throwaway, but it mirrors almost exactly a fragment from a Siege Remembrances account, in which Valdor is seen to do the same before a toppled statue of a legion master. The author of the Librum Aurum had seen Valdor walk the ash-choked halls. There is no other conclusion that fits. Those who read the Librum do not remain untouched. The earliest Hereticus reports, the ones written in crisp, outraged script before the fatigue of endless suppression dulled their edge, include anecdotes of symptoms manifested in those who had watched the drama performed in makeshift theatres or read transcriptions by stolen lamplight. They speak of troopers in battered regiments waking from uneasy sleep with the taste of ash in their mouths, insisting they had walked along gold-plated corridors that moved under their feet, every step leaving bloody prints that faded before they could be followed. They describe officers staring too long at the ornaments on their armor until the polished brass and gold filigree seemed to dim and stain before their eyes, as if something malignant were seeping up from beneath. There are accounts, in the margins of execution orders, of men found repainting the imperial Aquila in ways that made their commanders blanch. The wings remained, the heads remained, but the pure, proud gold that should have coated that symbol was instead rendered in a flat, faded yellow, with hair-thin strokes of darker pigment creeping like mold through the feathers. When questioned, the artists could give no reason for their choice. They wept as they spoke of a king who demanded that the eagle show its true colors. All of those men died badly. Their blood did not wash the stain from the idea they had brushed against. The Hereticus conclaves took the Libram seriously. They hunted its script through the underhive hab theatres and the ragged remnant camps, burning pamphlets, executing playwrights, hanging actors whose only crime was speaking lines that had come too easily to their tongues. They seized data copies and sealed them in vaults like the one I found, trusting in holy writ and heavy doors to keep the infection contained. They did not understand that ideas, once shaped, flow like warp tides. They do not respect plasteel and seals. I read further. In my mind, the palace city coalesced. I saw the endless, rearranging streets, the bone foundations, the sea of black tar lapping at its feet. I watched the nameless king move through that labyrinth like a fixed point, a fulcrum around which reality buckled. And I came to the scene that more than any other laid bare the particular cruelty of this Yellow Lord. A traitor Astartes kneels in chains. The script does not give his legion, but he bears the marks of the Istvan atrocities upon his plate, areas where ceramite has bubbled and warped under the caress of exotic weapons. The color of his armor is smeared and indistinct beneath layers of soot and blood. His helm has been torn away, exposing a face carved in hard lines by gene engineering and war, now mottled with bruising. One eye socket is a ruined hole, the orb within pulped. His remaining eye rolls, white showing around iris as he strains against the chains that hold his massive arms spread. The king stands before him, the axe resting its head on the gold-plated floor. The pale fire along its edge burns low, like banked coals waiting for a breath to flare. Behind the king, the hall stretches away into shadow, lined with statues of warriors whose features have been worn smooth, their names chiseled away and replaced with blank, mocking space. The traitor begs for death. That is the important detail. He does not mock as the Kornat madmen do. He does not spit out curses to the ruinous powers. He has seen enough of what the king does in these halls to plead instead. He promises information. He offers oaths. He offers service. Then, when none of these purchase mercy, he begs simply for an end, his voice cracking, his words blurring into hoarse animal sounds. The king listens. When the begging finally dwindles into sobs, he speaks. His voice, the script notes, is calm. There is no anger there, no heat, no satisfaction. It is the tone of a functionary reading out a ledger of debts. He recounts, in flat detail, the worlds this Astartes helped burn, the cities whose populations he herded at Bolter Point into makeshift arenas to watch their leaders die. The astropathic choirs he silenced with his own hands so that relief would never come. He names ships, regiments, individuals. He speaks of children trampled by retreating tanks, of men ordered to stand their ground when the ground itself was dissolving under demonic ichor. He speaks for a long time, and with every name the traitor's shoulders hunch a little more. When he is done, the king does not raise the axe. He steps aside. He leans the weapon against one of the blank-faced statues. He reaches instead into the shadow of his cloak and draws out a key. It is described as small, absurdly so, against his gauntleted fingers, a sliver of metal and bone inscribed with sigils that hurt to read. He kneels. He unlocks the chains. The traitor's arms fall free. His legs are unshackled. He collapses to the floor, blinking up in stupid disbelief. He does not rise. The king looks down at him. He tells him that death is a kindness he will not grant. He tells him that the wound he has inflicted upon the species is not something that can be balanced by a single stroke of an axe. He speaks of the palace, of the city, of the ruined world beyond. He gestures, and the walls around them become windows, showing vistas of ash plains, of broken hives, of seas turned to sludge. He tells the traitor that he will walk this ruin alone, without weapons, without armor, without purpose, until his mind breaks under the weight of what he sees, and he can no longer tell whether the figures he meets in the cracked mirrors of the palace are living men or reflections of his own guilt. Then the king turns away. He takes up the axe. He leaves the traitor where he lies. The last stage direction of the scene notes, with cruel precision, that the Astartes does not move until the king's footsteps have faded. Only then does he stagger to his feet and take a stumbling step down a corridor that already seems to be shifting under him. This is not the hot rage of the blood god. It is not the ecstatic cruelty of Slanesh, nor the diffuse malice of Nurgle, nor the scheming precision of Tzeentch. It is something colder. It is the logic of a man who has spent a lifetime enacting judgments and has come to understand that there are fates worse than a clean death. It is custodial cruelty. It is the punishment of a jailer who knows that the prison is all that is left. Why a play and not a chronicle? Why encode this vision of the palace in ruin and its yellow lord as drama, complete with stage directions, character lists, suggested choruses? The question gnawed at me as I read. In the era of ruin, men were drowning in truths they could not articulate. They walked through cities where the walls still whispered with psychic aftershocks. They stepped over bones that had not finished cooling. They served under commanders who carried the weight of their own compromises in every movement. To chronicle such things baldly would have been to invite censure, or worse, pity. A report can be dismissed. A witness can be shot. A play, though, a play can be denounced as fiction even as it scrapes its nails along the raw edges of memory. One can say it is allegory, satire, nonsense. One can hide best in plain sight. The Librum Aurum reads like the confession of someone who stood too close to the throne in those first centuries and needed to bleed the vision out of his skull before it poisoned him entirely. He could not name Valdor. He could not accuse the emperor's household. So he cast the palace as Carcosa and its regent as the king and hoped that distance would save him. It did not. The Hereticus hounds tracked him as they tracked his script. But the method is telling. Side stories, novellas, apocrypha. These are where the Imperium's truer shapes are often glimpsed. The great parade histories lie in state upon lecterns, their gilded covers too heavy for common hands. Meanwhile, in the margins, actors whisper banned lines in underhive amphitheaters, and scribes copy forbidden dramas, line by the light of Elcho sticks. Truth runs along those side channels like tainted water. There is, in the Librum, a marginal figure who appears in several scenes. He is never fully described, always at the edge of the stage. A robed shape whose garments are stitched with 1,000 small symbols, each a title, each a name. His hood is deep, and no actor ever lifts it. When he speaks, it is always to the king, and always in whispers that the other characters strain to hear, but cannot quite discern. He is called by many epithets: the Counselor, the Grey One, the Hand of the Throne. In one scene, a flagellant chorus mutters that he has died 100 times, and is still not done. In another, a doomed officer insists that the robed figure was the one who first told him to report to the palace, setting his doom in motion. You do not need my guidance to see Malcador's shadow stretched over that role, distorted by distance and trauma. Perhaps the author had seen the sigillite in life. Perhaps he had only heard stories. Perhaps he conflated every robed advisor and schemer into a single archetype. What interests me is not the precise identity of this counselor, but the fact that he speaks only to the king. They are twinned in the text, as they were twinned in life. the grey-robed administrator and the golden executioner, now rendered as a faceless whisperer and a nameless monarch in rotted armor. Even after Malcador's death, even after the emperor's internment, the pattern holds in the minds of those who lived through the era of ruin. Rule is not a single figure on a golden chair. It is a dialogue between hidden powers. The Librum knows this, even as it tries to bury that knowledge under theatrical artifice. The more I read, the more I came to see the Librum Aurum not as a heretical indulgence, but as a key. Here, in scripted form, is the first textual evidence of Valdor, perceived not merely as the Emperor's guard, not merely as a warrior, but as a role that bends the narrative around it. The king in yellow is not a name, not truly. It is a mask, a set of behaviors, a locus of symbolism. The armor might crack and be reforged. The man within might age, break, die. The mask persists. It can be worn by whatever entity stands in that hall of shifting gold and bone and enacts judgment in the name of a silent god. When I tried to close the file, the reader balked. The noospheric runes flickered. The machine spirit muttered in complaint, its binaric chatter dripping from the vox grill like the babble of a fevered penitent. For a moment, the text hung frozen in the air, the last line of the last scene hovering before my eyes. He stands where his master cannot. Then, with a crackle, the projection died. The vault was dark, save for the feeble lumen globe and the glow of my own auspex. I should have returned the cylinder to its shelf. I should have sealed the vault and left, and perhaps if I had done so, that would have been the end of it. Instead, I removed the cylinder, cradled it in both hands, and felt again that unnatural warmth, that slow, foreign heartbeat. The Hereticus conclaves tried to destroy this thing. I know this, not from their decrees, which insist that the Librum was successfully purged, but from the frustration that seeps through their private notes. There are laments about corrupted data that reform, about printed copies that resist flame or whose ash, when scattered, blows back into men's faces in patterns that spell banned lines. There is a report of an entire archive wing destroyed by controlled detonation after its shelves began to fill, overnight, with copies of the drama written in different hands, on different parchment, as if the building itself were copying the script in its dreams. When I attempt to erase the cylinder's content, the reader only whines and throws up erroglyphs that I have never seen before, jagged sigils that mean nothing in Binharic. When I try to overwrite the data with sanctioned catechisms, the new text appears for a moment, then resolves into lines from the play, the words shifting under my gaze with a lazy, inevitable malice. I have destroyed the cylinder more than once. I have crushed it under boot heel until brass and crystal cord components are mashed into glittering paste. I have fed those fragments into a recycler and watched them disgorged as nothing but inert powder. I have cast that dust into the recycler's fire and listened to it hiss. Each time, days or weeks later, I find the cylinder again on a different shelf, in a different vault, in a different archive entirely, with scratches and dents that bear mute witness to its prior suffering, and an unblemished title etched upon its skin. Librum Aurum, the Book of Yellow. It comes back. It is found by archive clerks who do not remember finding it, lying on their desks among their tabulations. It rolls from the mouths of dead servitors when their skulls crack. It appears in the satchels of novice interrogators who swear they have never seen it before. The script within is never precisely the same. Scenes shift, lines alter. A sentence that once referred obliquely to the king now names him directly. A character who was merely described as a faceless counselor now wears a circlet of bone. The core remains, the palace of bone and gold, the Black Sea, the nameless monarch in yellowed armor who passes judgment on all who walk those halls. It is as if something tied to the throne, to the warp reaction mass of a god, kept alive by screaming souls, to the lingering presence of a man who has stood too long in that light, wants this story told, as if it cannot speak plainly, bound as it is in machinery and tradition and denial, so it leaks out in drama and nightmare and the compulsive scratching of quills. We tried to burn the book. We tried to break the cylinder. They refuse us. That alone should terrify you more than any demon I have ever banished. There is a symbol that should not exist. In truth, it should be impossible. The administratum prides itself on the ruthless uniformity of its heraldry. The Ministerum codifies every angle of the holy icons, every feather of the Aquila's wings, every acceptable variation catalogued and sanctified. Iconoclasts and inspired artisans alike have been broken on the wheel for less than a stray brushstroke, yet buried in the strata of the early post-heresy centuries, in the brittle parchment of forgotten campaign logs and the flaking paint of defaced shrine frescoes, there appears a version of the imperial eagle that no current catechism acknowledges. I have come to think of it as the half-ruined Palatine Aquila. At a glance, it is familiar. Two-headed, wings spread, talons poised above a broken chain. It is the same god-bird that glares down from a million fortress walls, the same sigil pressed into wax on decree scrolls, tattooed into the skin of conscripts, burned into the flesh of heretics. But look closer, in those rare instances where the icon has not been scrubbed away or overpainted by some later zealot, and the wrongness becomes apparent. One head is chipped, not elegantly eroded by time, but smashed, as if by a desperate hammer blow. In some depictions, the break is clean, the head entirely gone, leaving only a jagged stump and the ghost of a neck. In others, it lingers as a melted lump, one eye socket a black hole, beak twisted like a broken finger. The remaining head stares on, its gaze too wide, its beak stretched in a grimace that might be pride or pain. The wings are scorched at their tips, feathers clumped as if they have flown through smoke that never cleared. In one mural I found in the undercrypt of a shrine on Sol, dried rivulets of once red pigment run down from the damaged head, as if the eagle had bled onto the stone. You do not see this thing often. Compared to the standard, unsullied Aquila, the half-ruined form is almost myth. It lurks in the margins of history, a banner fragment preserved in a reliquary, because it flew above some nameless regiment's last stand, a frontispiece to an early Scouring-era devotional that has long since been replaced by more orthodox editions, a wax seal on an execution order so old that the document crumbles at a touch, yet the impression of the broken head remains as sharp as the day the ring pressed it. The Imperium teaches a progression of eagles. First came the Raptor Imperialis, the stylized, single-headed bird that graced the banners of the unification. It was predatory, forward-facing, its wings swept in a pose of imminent strike. That icon belonged to a warlord who had not yet fully decided what shape his rule would take, a conqueror still in the act of hammering terror into a single bleeding hole. Then, in the days of the Great Crusade and the heresy, came the Palatine Aquila, twin-headed, each face turned to a different horizon, its wings more formal, more architectural. This was the symbol of empire, of a state that claimed to look to past and future, to spirit and matter, to terror and to the stars. It adorned the breastplates of Astartes, the hulls of starships, the gates of newly compliant cities. It peered down from the domes of the imperial palace as Primarch strode its halls. Finally, in the long night of the later millennia, the Imperium settles upon the Aquila that we now know too well. Its lines are ossified. Its presence is ubiquitous. It is less a living bird than a carved idol, frozen, omnipresent, stamped on every surface until it ceases to mean anything more than authority and fear. It is the eagle of the grinding machine, of an empire that no longer remembers how to be young. The damaged Palatine form sits between these states like a splinter. It is recognizably the eagle of the Crusade and the heresy, not yet calcified into the overworked symbol of late imperial piety. Yet it is wounded, scorched, sheared. It appears in that yawning gulf after the siege, and before the bureaucrats and preachers of later ages managed to plaster their own certainties over the raw wounds. It belongs to the era of ruin. I have spent long nights in the archives, staring at the broken head. The twin-headed eagle has always been read as duality. One head looking to the realm of the material, the other to the realm of the spirit. One to terror, one to the stars. One to war, one to governance. These interpretations serve, as far as they go, but symbols, once forged, accumulate meanings like barnacles. Context coats them. Consider another reading. One head, the emperor. The other, the regent. The master of mankind is the obvious sovereign represented by the Aquila. His is the hand that raised the armies and broke the warlords. His is the mind that conceived the throne. His is the presence that, even now, roots reality in place. Yet no king rules alone. A throne is a stage as much as a seat. Beside the emperor, there has always been the figure who enacts his will where he cannot or will not tread. Malcador wore that second crown openly for a time, grey-robed and weary, sitting in a lesser version of the throne and signing away lives with quill and seal. Valdor wore it in armor and blood, his crown an auramite helm. Between them, parchment and blade, the empire was governed. In an Aquila where one head has been smashed, scorched, gouged out, what are we being shown? The commentaries, when they bother to address this icon at all, call it a damaged or blasphemed symbol, probably the work of treacherous hands or enemy fire. They recommend its destruction and replacement. They shy away from any more complex reading. Yet the damaged eagles I have found crop up not in enemy propaganda, but in our own sanctioned works from that era. On the cover of an early scouring campaign log penned by a remembrancer whose other works are deemed acceptable, the half-ruined Aquila hangs above a sketch of the blasted segmentum war zones, its maimed head turned toward terror, the intact one glaring out into the stars. On the front plate of a devotional history attributed to a scribe called Caval, a book that attempted to make sense of the decades after the heresy and was later quietly retired from circulation, the damaged eagle perches atop the image of the palace, one head gone entirely, the other weeping stylized tears, illuminated margins. Around certain records of Custodes operations in the same period show the Aquila in miniature with one head limned faintly, as if being erased. These are not random accidents. Illuminators and printers of that age knew the weight of their brush strokes. No journeyman would dare alter the sacred symbol without some form of permission or prompting, spoken or otherwise. When a variant icon turns up again and again across different works, in different hands, and always in relation to the same historical span, it is broadcasting something that the text cannot safely say. The era of ruin does not lend itself to neat narratives. It is, in every meaningful sense, a hangover after a galaxy-wide debauch. Imagine terror after the siege. The void above it is still choked with wreckage, kilometer-long ribs of starships twisted into graveyard constellations. The orbits are fouled with minefields whose overseers are dead. The planet's atmosphere is a soup of ash, promethium vapor, and the residual stink of burned flesh. The great hives around the palace are half gutted, their spires snapped, their lower levels flooded with toxic sludge and refugee human biomass. The continents beyond are stitched with trenches, rad deserts, and battlefields where the dead lie in layers, the uppermost corpses already rotten, the older ones compressed into soil. Chain of command is a joke told among starving survivors. Legions that did not fall to treachery are shattered, their numbers gutted, their command structures wrecked by the loss of trusted lieutenants and brother officers. The Mechanicus fights itself in the redoubt cities as loyalist and half-tainted forge lords struggle over control of god machines and manufactoria lines. The Astra Militarum as we know it does not yet exist. There are only remnant regiments and hastily raised militias, commanded by whoever has the loudest voice and the most ammunition. In this liminal horror, where everything familiar has been broken and nothing new has yet hardened into place, the damaged Aquila makes sense. It is the eagle of a state that knows one of its heads is gone, but cannot admit which. Stories survive from those years of Astartes, wandering terror, like dazed angels in rusted armor. They are called, in one apocryphal collection, angels of another age. Veterans of the crusade who survived the treacheries of their gene-sires and the madness of their brothers find themselves with no clear purpose. They sit on broken stairways in the palace, helm in hand slick with old blood, staring at the walls as if trying to recall what color they were before the soot. They drift through the wreckage of the hives, towering figures wrapped in torn cloaks, their chapter sigils scraped off or mutilated, unrecognizable even to their own kind. I picture Valdor walking among them. The Primarchs have gone, one way or another. Some dead, some damned, some fled into the night with their legions, some missing, their fates, whispered of only in the most secure councils. The angels of the old wars have broken wings. What remains are broken demigods and burned monuments and a throne hall that reeks of sanctified machinery and slow death. This is the kingdom over which Valdor finds himself de facto sovereign, where once his golden spear struck down techno-barbarians beneath a bruised sky, now his authority extends over corridors lined with amputated statues, their faces smashed in, but their plinths intact. His 10,000 stalk the half-rebuilt galleries like gilded ghosts, their presence a reminder that not all of the old war is over. He rules nothing, and yet he rules everything, because no other living being has the right to stand as close to the Emperor's withered frame as he does. The official record says that the custodes withdraw in this era, that they turn their attention inward, focusing on the defense of the palace, of the throne, of the webway breach. They no longer stride forth at the head of campaigns. They cede that role to the nascent chapters, to the reformed legions that will become the Astartes as we know them. The 10,000 become rare, almost mythical, their interventions the stuff of hushed rumor. Look at that from another angle. They retreat from view, yes, but into where? Into the palace, into the sancta, into the halls that the half-ruined Aquila crowns in those forbidden frescoes. They do not become less powerful, they become more concentrated. Their authority is distilled, not diluted. They are the only blades carried where no other weapon may be drawn. They are the only eyes that witness the daily reality of the Emperor's continued undeath. In withdrawing from the wider wars, they fold themselves entirely around the heart of the Imperium. That is how you consolidate a hidden monarchy. The light in the Golden Hall changes. In the days before the heresy, Remembrancer paintings and Mechanicus Picts alike portray the throne's radiance as a clean, almost white gold. It is the light of forge fire tamed, of a newborn star. In the era of ruin, scattered apocryphal descriptions take on a different character. An astropath, whose mind burned even as he sent one final message to a distant fleet, scrawled in his own blood that the light above him was the color of sick skin stretched too tight over bone. A steward of the palace who later died under questioning spoke, tearful and half-drunk, of gold that had soured, of brilliance that left after-images like yellow bruises on the eyelids. The auramite of the custodes reflects that change. Once, it was the hue of the Emperor's banners, of his armor, of his ideals beaten into metal. Now, in those accounts, it is described as harsh, glaring, almost painful to look upon when the throne's glow is at its strongest. The outlines of their pauldrons blur in that light. Their cloaks seem heavy, stiff with accumulated dust and blood that no amount of polishing can quite erase. A handful of mad, penitent artists, executed for their insolence, dared sketch the guardians of the throne, not in shining gold, but in layered ochre and yellow, as if they were statues carved from diseased bone and then lacquered. They were closer to the truth than they knew. In that light, the half-ruined Aquila takes on a new meaning. It ceases to be a simple marker of allegiance. It becomes a warning, a morbid reminder of a treaty broken, a crown cracked. The remaining head is not proud but straining, veins standing out on its neck as it tries to hold a pose that was meant to be shared. The missing head is a void where a co-ruler should be. The king in yellow is that absence given form. He is not a separate god, not an invader from the outer dark. He is the shadow cast by the missing head of the eagle. He is the reflection of Valdor's silent regency in the warped mirror of the warp. Half divine authority, half corpse, half crown, half wound. A living embodiment of a symbol that the Imperium has tried, clumsily, to suppress. When I overlay the occurrences of the damaged Aquila upon a map of recorded events, a pattern emerges that is too neat to be coincidence. Wherever that half-ruined eagle appears, there also cluster tales of Custodes' intervention, of era of ruin traumas, of unnamed golden warriors passing sentence in corridors choked with ash. In the Cavil history, whose cover bears that maimed bird, there is a chapter hinting at a series of purges in the underpalace levels, carried out by figures never named, their actions authorized by edicts whose seals have been excised.
Be sure to subscribe. You know you want to. If you don't, you'll be sent to the void and nobody will find you for the rest of your life. So go. Be sure to subscribe. Remember, subscribe.
In the campaign log with the broken-headed Aquila stamped above its map of war zones, there is a footnote about a single custodian appearing on a battlefield to strike down a renegade Lord Solar before vanishing into the smoke. In murals where the damaged eagle spreads its wings over the throne, the faces of the warriors kneeling below are often scratched away, while the form of one central figure in auramite remains untouched. Symbols have their own language. They speak in repetition, in placement, in the stubbornness with which they resurface, even after hammers and chisels have set to work. The half-ruined Palatine Aquila is the badge of a wound the Imperium will not acknowledge. It is the sigil of a regency that has been written out of the official script, but which persists in the subconscious of artists, scribes, and heretics alike. Follow it closely enough, and you will find yourself, as I have, drawn inexorably back to the same hall of jaundiced light, to the same figure standing before a throne that eats souls, his armor stained, his crown unseen. The histories call it the scouring. They stamp that word across whole volumes of campaign records and tactical manuals, as if a single neat label could tidy what came after the heresy into a sequence of offensives and counter-offensives. The diagrams show arrows carving through space, red for loyalists, black for traitors, as if all that followed was merely a matter of fleets moving along charted lanes, of worlds changing hands, of numbers tallied on parchment. That is the lie. The scouring was not a campaign. It was an emotional convulsion. Imagine the state of those who survived the siege and the first howling years when the galaxy realized that its gods bled. Loyalists who had watched their brothers turn and tear down everything they had built. Traitors who had thrown in their lot with beings that made promises and then laughed as the skulls piled high. Mortals who had endured long years of the Great Crusade, believing that the sacrifices were building towards something better than the old night, only to see their efforts drowned in blood and ash. The scouring is the name we give to what they did with that pain. For the loyal, it was vengeance dressed as duty. They tore into the fleeing traitor legions with a fervor that burnt hotter than plasma, not because it was strategically sound, but because they could not bear the thought that those who had shattered their world might escape. The histories will tell you that such wrath was righteous. They will not dwell on the exhausted eyes of commanders who ordered population purges on worlds that had wavered for a moment under the arch-traitor's shadow, just to prove to themselves that they still had control over something. For the traitors, it was a frantic scramble to redefine themselves. Some tried to frame their rebellion as a principled stand against tyranny. Others surrendered themselves wholly to the warp lords whose whispers had ruined them, becoming parodies of the ideals they once professed. The Scouring's darkest battles, in the half-ruined sectors where both sides were equally shattered, were less about banners and more about men trying to prove that their choices had meaning. In such an environment, facts are fragile things. Myths breed like flies. Every war story told around a low fire in a gutted hab becomes a seed. Every officer who signs his name to a report bends the memory of events with the weight of his own guilt. The administratum scribes who later gather these accounts and scrape them into sanctioned chronicles are not neutral. They are men with careers, loyalties, fears. Their quills move in ways that flatter their patrons and spare their own consciences. Whole episodes are cut away. Others are exaggerated until they wobble under the weight of added glory. If you want to see the Scouring as it was, you must look not at the main texts, but at the stains that bleed through the parchment. It is in those stains that you find the touch of the Emperor's hidden monarch. The official record is coy about the custodes in this era. It makes sense. The 10,000 had paid dearly in the defense of Terra. Whole shield cohorts of gilded demigods died on the walls and in the halls, their corpses joining the heaps of Astartes, mortal soldiery, and civilian dead, when the guns finally fell silent. The surviving custodians were recalled, we are told, to their true calling, the defense of the throne and the palace. Yet, scattered through the earliest Scouring edicts, there are phrases that betray more active hands. Exterminations, authorized by decree of the Captain General. Purge actions sanctioned upon consultation with the Golden Council. Levels of access to certain threat files restricted to custodial oversight. No Astartes or Astra Militarum clearance permitted. These are not the notes of mere guardsmen. These are the annotations of unseen legislators, deciding which worlds are too tainted to be allowed to persist, which commanders are too unstable to be left in their posts, which nascent fiefdoms must be decapitated before they can grow into independent powers. The blade of the custodes carves policy as surely as it carves flesh. There is, preserved in the personal archive of a long-dead Lord Militant whose name means nothing to most, an oral testimony that should have been destroyed. The document is written in a cramped, hurried hand, as if the scribe feared someone might walk in at any moment and drag him from his bench. It claims to be a transcription of the delirious confession of a veteran trooper of the Solar Auxilia taken in an infirmary on Terra during the first decades of the Scouring. The trooper's lungs were half scarred by rad exposure. His words, the scribe notes, came in gasps. He died less than an hour after the last line was recorded. He speaks of a hunt in the ash wastes of a once proud Terran subcontinent. The land had been blasted flat by orbital fire and macro-artillery. What had once been forests, cities, rivers, was now a rolling expanse of grey and black, occasional knuckles of melted architecture punching up through the dust like the bones of some buried god. Wind whipped the ash into low, constant storms that scoured exposed skin, raw and filled armor joints with fine grit. The sky was a uniform bruise. The troopers' regiment had been sent to flush out a war band of traitor legionaries that had burrowed into the ruins of a palace complex, perhaps seeking relics, perhaps simply unable to accept that their war on Terra was over. They expected Astartes. They did not expect Custodes. He describes first hearing them rather than seeing them. A low, measured rhythm of boots on broken marble, unhurried, deliberate, cutting through the thin screams of the wind. His vox crackled with orders, voices strained, officers barking at their men to hold formation, to brace, to remember their training. Over those human sounds came another voice, flat and calm, calling deployment markers in a code the trooper did not recognize. The Terminators in his chapter had spoken in something like that when they coordinated teleports, but this was harsher, older. Then he saw them. They came striding out of the grey like statues that had decided to walk. Their armor was gold, but not the polished, parade ground gold of propaganda picts. It was scarred and darkened, plates dulled by ash and by burns that had melted the outer layers into uneven ripples. Their cloaks, once rich with embroidery, hung heavy with clotted ash and old blood, the patterns beneath barely visible. Each carried a spear whose blade glowed faintly, pale light licking along the metal edge. Ash hissed and seethed when it touched those blades, vaporized by whatever power slept within. The Solar Auxilia did not know whether to salute or flee. Their commanders did not know whether to welcome them or protest the intrusion. It did not matter. The Custodes did not pause to announce themselves. They passed through the mortal lines like a hammer through smoke and went straight for the ruins. The traitors met them there. The trooper had seen Astartes before, during the siege. He knew their scale, the way their presence warped a battlefield. These were worse. The traitor legionaries that boiled out of the palace ruins were swollen with corruption and desperation. Their armor was cracked and overpainted. New sigils crawled over old, horns and barbs jutted from once perfect ceramite. Their bolters barked in hungry bursts, rounds whining in the thick air. Chainswords droned, teeth clogged with ancient meat. Some bellowed names of warped gods, others simply howled. The Custodes did not slow. Bolter fire hammered their shields, blowing out chunks of ash behind them in great gouts. Where rounds struck auramite, they detonated in bursts of shrapnel and smoke, leaving scorched patches and shallow craters. None broke through. The Custodes closed, and then the ash waste became a slaughter yard. The trooper's account turns choppy here, his words dissolved into expletives and half-remembered catechisms. You can feel his mind trying and failing to process what he saw. He speaks of a traitor in sea-green plate, lunging at a custodian, chain axe rising, only for the guardian's spear to dart in. With a speed that belied its size, the blade sliding into the juncture between gorget and helm. There is a snap, like a dry branch breaking. The traitor's head comes away in a clean, wet arc, spinal cord stretching, then tearing, spraying glistening ropes of blood and spinal fluid across cracked marble. The body remains standing for a heartbeat, arterial fountains painting the custodian's shield, before collapsing in a boneless heap. Another legionary, this one in armor, stained a dirty white caked over with gore and filth, charges from the flank, both chainsword and bolt pistol spitting. The custodian turns, shield raised, rounds scream against it, warheads detonating in blooms of fire that wash over the golden surface and gutter out. The chainsword bites, teeth screeching against the shield's edge, sending up a storm of sparks. The custodian takes the impact, lets it slide, then steps inside with inhuman grace, the butt of his spear whipping around to cave in the traitors. Helmet, ceramite crumples. The skull within yields, pulped brains and bone shards blasting out through the eye lenses in a grey-red slurry. He writes of a warrior in crimson and brass, horns curling from his helm, roaring as he swung a heavy chain axe in blows that carved trenches in the marble. The custodian he faced did not block. He weaved, each blow passing within a finger's breadth of his helm. Where the axe struck, the ground exploded in shards of stone and fountains of ash. Finally, as the traitor committed himself to an overhead chop, the custodian stepped in, shoulder to chest, and rammed the spear point up under the breastplate. The traitor's scream cut off with a wet gurgle as the blade burst from his back in a fan of cracked vertebrae and shredded lung. The custodian twisted. The upper half of the traitor's torso tore free, with a sound like meat ripped from bone, spilling innards in steaming ropes. The ash wastes drank it all. The ashes turned to a sticky paste. Beneath the custodes' boots, grey turning to black with mixing gore. Broken helms lay like discarded skulls. Broken skulls lay like discarded helms. It was, the trooper said, like watching gods butcher one another with meat hooks. He never saw a single custodian fall. When it was done, when the last traitor's death spasms had twitched into stillness, the golden warriors moved among the corpses, driving spear points through any spine that twitched, any finger that flexed. They decapitated those whose mutations they deemed too egregious to leave intact. They stacked the heads, helmets on and off, in neat pyramids that steamed in the cold air. One, taller than the rest, walked to the edge of the ruined palace, looked back once at the mortal regiment, and then descended into the darkness beneath the ruins, without a word. The others followed. The trooper never saw them again. When he told his story, his commanding officers urged the scribe to mark the whole account as battlefield, hallucination. The sigils in the margins, however, show that the Inquisition reviewed the testimony and sealed it. The note appended by a later hand, in the dry script of a High Lord Secretary, reads only, "Custodial action verified, details restricted." Policy-level monarchy, written in blood, hidden under ash. In the council chambers of terror, the high lords of those early centuries wrestled with the task of rebuilding an empire that had nearly strangled itself. We have partial records of their sessions, enough to sketch the shape of their debates, if not the full force. They argue over tithe rates, over reorganization of the legions into smaller chapters, over how to deal with worlds that had declared for the War Master and then repudiated him. Their transcripts are full of bluster, of carefully calibrated outrage, of sanctimonious self-justification. They are also threaded with a recurring phrase, "After consultation with the Captain General of the Legio Custodes, in matters concerning the disposition of forces too near to terror, in questions about how far to trust a returning legion, in decisions about whether a Forge World's tech priesthood is sufficiently purged of treachery," that line appears. In some cases, it is added as a marginal note, squeezed between lines after the session. In others, it sits in the main body, as if spoken aloud. Consultation with the Captain General. Valdor does not appear in the seating plans. He does not sit among the lords. There is no chair carved for him in the recorded layouts of the council chambers. Yet his shadow lies across their words. They rise to speak, only to fall silent as a note is passed, as a glare from a sun guard at the back of the hall reminds them who stands at the gates to this room and to the throne beyond. Proposals that would have offended the custode's sense of the Emperor's will are neutered or abandoned. Votes shift after private meetings whose minutes are sealed. This is what monarchy looks like when it is too honest to bother with crowns. You may ask, rightly, why such a figure vanishes from the broader record as the millennia roll on. By the time we reach the codified, sterilized lore of the later Imperium, the name of Constantin Valdor is little more than a footnote. He is a saint of battle mentioned in passing, a demigod of the deep past, invoked in oaths by those who do not truly understand what they are saying. The 10,000 are known, feared, admired, but their Captain General is always a title, never a man. It is as if the part has been prized loose from the player. There are only a few explanations that fit. The first is simple death. Perhaps Valdor, though greater than any mortal, was still a man whose body eventually failed. Perhaps he fell in some secret battle, his corpse entombed in a nameless vault, his deeds thereafter wrapped in ritual silence. This seems unlikely. No other loss of such magnitude is treated so casually by our histories. The death of a Primarch is a saga. The fall of a High Lord is a scandal. The extinguishing of the Emperor's right hand would not go unmarked unless someone worked very hard to erase it. The second is ascension. Perhaps he became something more, some shard of the Emperor's own slowly dissolving divinity, his soul or psychic pattern folded into the greater blaze that howls through the Astronomicon. This kind of speculation is dangerously close to theology, and I am no preacher. There are hints, however, in the mutterings of certain Ministorum mystics, of a golden angel who walks the corridors of light within the Emperor's mind, spear in hand. The third, and to my mind most convincing, is transformation. A being that spends centuries standing at the very edge of the golden throne, bathing in its warp light, breathing air saturated with its bleed, hearing the whispers of the souls that are fed into it day after day, does not remain entirely human in any meaningful sense. Identity in the 41st millennium is not a static, flesh-bound thing. It is a pattern, an echo in the warp that can be stretched, amplified, distorted. Valdor could have stepped sideways into a role, into a vibration in that howling chorus that no longer fits the neat boxes of a biographical entry. He becomes, in this view, less a person and more a position. In the heretical fragments that survive from later millennia, a figure appears who bears an uncomfortable resemblance to that position made manifest. They call him the Yellow King, a radical psyker of the later 36th millennium, writing in a code he believed his senses could not crack, speaks of a dream in which a towering warrior in cracked golden plate stood at the foot of his bed. The man's armor was flaked and worn, the gold beneath showing through in unhealthy patches of yellow. His helm was wrought in the style of the old custodes, but its features shifted. One moment a smooth death mask, the next a snarling visage, the next blind. The psyker writes that the warrior spoke to him without moving his jaw, voice resonating in his skull, advising him to burn an entire shrine world whose priests had grown too fond of their own power. When the psyker woke, his chamber was filled with yellow dust. He carried out the purge. He died in turn on a pyre built by those who replaced him, but his journals endure. A doomed inquisitor of the Ordo Hereticus turned renegade in the 38th millennium and hunted down by his former peers, left behind a fragmentary memoir. In it, he recounts seeking an audience with what he calls the conscience of terror. He descends into the lower levels of the palace, past wards and sigil-locked doors that should not have opened, called by a dream that stank of incense and burning blood. At the end of that descent, he finds a hall of cracked gold, and in it a figure seated on a throne of rubble, armor a patchwork of auramite, and exposed, corroded metal. The figure's spear is planted point down, its blade dark. His cloak is in tatters. He sounds tired when he speaks, as if every word were dragged up from a well of exhaustion deeper than worlds. He offers the Hereticus Inquisitor a choice: abandon his crusade, or continue and be hunted not only by his peers, but by something that stands outside their hierarchies. The Inquisitor chooses defiance. The last line of his account, scrawled in a hand shaking with pain, asserts that when the spear struck him, it drove not into his flesh, but into his sins, pinning them to the world. Custodian features, not custodian. The description is always blurred, as if the writer's mind cannot fix the details. They speak of auramite, of guardian spears, of the hauteur of a demigod bred to stand in judgment. They also speak of cracks, of patches where the gold has leached into something sicklier. They mention eyes that burn with a light too similar to that of the throne's own to be comfortable. They use metaphors drawn from disease, from rot, from theatre. The custodial cult of silence deepens in these same centuries. Once, the 10,000 were comparatively open, at least by their standards. Remembrancers were permitted to sketch them. Iterators interviewed them under watchful supervision, capturing their words to inspire the masses. Following the heresy, those channels close. The custodes cease to speak to chroniclers. They refuse to comment on their own past campaigns. They develop an internal language of sign and code that even their closest allies do not fully grasp. Inquiry into their history is politely deflected or met with cold, impassive stares. This is often framed by those who romanticize them as mystique, as the natural aloofness of beings whose concerns are too high for common folk. I see instead the tight-lipped discretion of men guarding a truth too dangerous to let slip even in jest. If their first and greatest Captain General no longer exists as a man, if he has become something that stalks the palace in visions and appears in heretical dreams, then admitting as much would be to unravel the Imperium's most cherished lie, that its core is stable. I return again to the Golden Throne. We are taught that it is a life support mechanism and a warp dam. Both statements, in their crude way, are true. But look at it also as a stage. On that stage, roles are played. Emperor, of course, is the central part, the wounded god nailed to his machinery. Around him move other players: regent, executioner, confessor. Each role has a costume, a set of gestures, a range of acceptable lines. Over millennia, different beings may occupy those roles. Malcador wears the regent's robes for a span. High lords parade in them briefly. Valdor dons them in armor. At some point, the role outlives the actor. The king in yellow is that role tattered and stained beyond recognition. He is the suffering regent, the one who stands where the sovereign cannot, who enacts judgment not out of hope for a better future, but out of grim obligation to prevent everything from collapsing at once. He is forced into the mask. The mask sticks. It fuses to the flesh. The actor beneath is forgotten, his name scraped away like the second head of the damaged Aquila. All that remains is the silhouette, the presence, the feel of a crown without a throne. What I have laid out so far is a chain. In the first link, we saw Valdor as the Emperor's golden executioner and crownless king, a being crafted to stand beside a god and wield authority that no mortal should hold. In the second, we entered the Librum Aurum, the forbidden drama that recast the ruined palace as Carcosa and its nameless monarch in yellowed armor as a figure whose cruelty mapped too neatly onto the Captain General's own. In the third, we traced the half-ruined Aquila through era of ruin iconography, reading its broken head as a visual confession of a co-regency the Imperium refuses to name. In this fourth, we have walked through the ash wastes of the Scouring and the secret councils of the early High Lords, witnessing the invisible hand that shapes policy while remaining officially absent. Each leg reinforces the others. The Librum's king, the broken eagle, the silent custodes, the heretical visions of a yellow lord in cracked gold, all point back to the same truth. The man who was Constantin Valdor slid, inch by inch, from auric clarity into jaundiced myth, until the distinction between him and the role he played was lost. You may still call this conjecture. You may say that I have followed patterns in the grain of history that were never intended to form an image, that I have made a face out of random stains as frightened men see saints in mold. That is possible. In an age where the warp lies just beyond every shadow, hallucination is as much a part of the weather as dust and radiation. And yet, in the final pages of this work, I will place before you testimonies that cannot be so easily explained away. Encounters in this dark age, and not just in the first miserable centuries, between imperial agents and a figure who matches, too closely for comfort, the amalgam of Valdor and the Yellow King. Men who have no interest in theatre, who have never heard of the Librum Aurum, who have never studied the nuances of Aquila iconography, have seen something in the halls of terror and in their own dreams that speaks in a voice like a spear scraping on stone. When you have read those accounts, you may decide for yourself whether the pattern I have traced is mere fancy, or whether the king in yellow walks still beneath the palace, crownless, unseen, ruling a kingdom of ash and bone. There are things buried beneath the palace that even inquisitors are warned not to seek. We like to tell ourselves that the Ordos are the sharpest knives in the Imperium's drawer, that our remit reaches into every shadow, that there is no door we cannot force, no vault we cannot unseal. It is an indulgent boast, born of pride and the need to believe that our sacrifices buy us real authority. The truth is that there are levels below Terra's bones where even an inquisitorial rosette is worth less than a handful of ash. The report I will begin with describes one of those depths. It comes from the later years of the 41st millennium, though the exact dating sigils are redacted to the point of uselessness. The heading is simple, written in the careful script of an administratum functionary who did not understand what his quill was being asked to name. Restricted incident transcript, palace sublevel. The party in question was led by a brother of my own Ordo, now long dead by decree. He was a man of rare intelligence and rarer sincerity. His seal, when he carried it, opened doors that had not been unlocked since the first days of the scouring. That was what doomed him. He had become obsessed with the heresy's missing years, not the public. Tragedies that every scholar drilled into its pupils, but the quiet gaps, the sealed edicts, the unnamed interventions. He chased whispers of a sealed archive beneath the palace, a place where the earliest inquisitorial conclaves had hoarded their most dangerous records. Against the advice of his peers and the outright prohibition of his superiors, he convinced a minor High Lord to sign a limited access warrant. With that scrap of parchment, he assembled a retinue and descended. The report is stitched together from several sources: Vox logs, servo skull-picked captures, snatches of Auspex readouts, all of it battered by distortion, as if the place itself resented being recorded. They make their way down by lift cage and then on foot, the air thickening as they descend, the walls sweating old moisture and older blood. The Inquisitor's voice is steady as he intones the litanies of protection, his words drifting in and out as static chews at the signal. His stormtroopers' boots clatter on iron grill and cracked stone. Their armor creaks, their respirators hiss. A tech adept mutters catechisms into the ear of a handheld logic engine, trying to persuade the half-senile machine spirit to keep its Auspex senses open. The corridors narrow. They pass doors that have been welded shut, their seams sealed with sigils of warding whose inks have faded, but whose intent still pricks at the skin. They cross a chamber where the floor is hidden under a thin crust of crystallized residue, as if some liquid had once flooded the space and then evaporated, leaving shimmering scabs behind. Their lamps pick out shapes in the walls that might be statues and might be something else entirely, half subsumed by growths of stone and rust. The last clear pick taken by the lead servo skull shows the party entering a wide, low hall supported by squat pillars. The air hangs thick, full of motes that reflect the lumen glare like drifting specks of dull gold. The floor is littered with debris, broken shelves, shattered stasis caskets, scraps of parchment so old they disintegrate as a trooper's boot touches them. At the far end, there is a door. It is not a door built by human hands. It does not match any known pattern. It is a block of metal and bone fused into the wall, its surface crawling with the faint suggestion of wings and skulls that might change when you look away. There are no handles, no hinges, only a seam and the psychic sense of something beyond it that makes the tech adept keen quietly under his Vox grill. The Inquisitor orders his men to take position. He approaches the door alone, rosette in one hand, the other resting on the pommel of his force blade. He begins a litany of access, words that have opened vaults on worlds most of us will never see, words that have made planetary governors fall to their knees in terror. The audio file records his voice clearly for a little while. Then it catches something else. There is a sound like metal, grinding on stone, low and drawn out. It is too regular to be mere tectonic shift, too deliberate to be accident. The Auspex readings spike, then drop, as if every machine unscrambled. One can see the lumen glare unscrambled. One can see the lumen glare changing. It dims without actually losing intensity, the way a healthy light dims when parchment is hung before it. The color shifts. What was a harsh, cold white from the troopers' lamps becomes a flat, unhealthy yellow, like the glow from old tallow candles. The particles in the air suddenly blaze, turning the space between the pillars into a haze of jaundiced motes. The figures of the retinue are silhouettes in that murk. Behind them, in the depth of the hall, something moves. The Pict catches it only in fragments. One servo skull freezes, its final image a smear of gold and shadow, a shoulder in cracked plate, a cloak that hangs in tattered folds. Another, turning as its machine spirit tries to flee, gives us a glimpse of a spear's shaft, etched with sigils that flare in pale fire, its blade lost in glare. A third, falling, shows boots stepping through a spray of droplets that might be oil and might be blood, each tiny sphere catching the yellow light and turning it opaque. The Vox feed fills with screaming. The report notes that the stormtroopers die in under a minute. Their armor, recovered later by a custodial sweep team, is described as peeled apart. Not burned through, not blasted by high-energy discharge, but peeled. Plate is separated from underlay, underlay from flesh, flesh from bone, each layer lifted and cast aside like strips carved from a carcass. Limbs are torn from joints cleanly enough that the apothecaries comment on the neatness. Heads are separated from spines without signs of hesitation. If there was resistance, it was brief. The Inquisitor's body is not, is warped there, bent inward as if reality has been bent by the vortex impact. The stone is warped there, bent inward as if reality itself had been hammered. Analysis of the tissue samples confirms his identity beyond doubt. His rosette is discovered embedded in a pillar, driven so deep that its edges are fused with the rock. There is only one surviving audio thread from those final seconds. Over the screams, over the static, over the high keening whine of machine spirits in agony, there is a voice. Calm, deep, touched by an accent that does not belong to any current region. It recites litanies. They are not those of the Ministorum. They are older. They match, in phrasing and order, the custodial battle cant recorded during the unification campaigns, the same chants that the 10,000 once spoke as they marched through chem storms and over fields of blackened bone in the air. Emperor's name. One line, clear amid the chaos, says simply, "He stands where his master cannot." That hall was sealed again, this time with stronger sigils and more fervent prayers. The incident was classified and hidden under layers of obfuscation. Yet the data survived, and in surviving, it joins the others. The second piece comes from closer to the heart of the palace, and from a source I hesitated to trust, even as I welcomed it. Custodians do not confess. Their culture is built upon control. Control of their bodies, honed and hardened. Control of their minds, disciplined from the moment of their creation. Control of their tongues, trained to speak only what is necessary, and often not even that. The idea of a custodian seeking solace in admission to another is alien. That is why the existence of the document shocks me still. It is not a confession in the Ministorum sense. There is no robed confessor, no blood-stained grill. It is a quiet admission, recorded in the private journal of a palace chirurgeon who once tended to injuries among the 10,000. The chirurgeon uses no names, only titles, but the detail with which he describes his subject leaves little doubt as to the man's station. A junior custodian, relatively freshly forged by their standards, came to him in the empty hours between vigils. His armor bore no battlefield marks. His body showed no scars beyond those of the original implants. His hands did not tremble. His stride did not falter. Yet his eyes, the chirurgeon writes, were not those of a man at ease. The custodian spoke rarely, even then. He described a recurring dream. In it, he kneels on the floor of the throne hall, not as he does in waking life, before the living corpse of the emperor and the grinding machinery that keeps him chained. In the dream, the hall is both the same and not. The walls are cracked, the gold leaf on their surfaces flaked away in long curling strips. The banners hang in tatters, they're embroidered. Glories eaten by smoke, the air tastes of old incense and the metallic tang of recently spilled blood. Before him stands a figure in auramite. The armor is familiar in cut, but its surfaces are wrong. The gold is not clean. It is blotched, patched, worn. In some places, the metal is stained a flat, unhealthy yellow, as if something had seeped outward from beneath and discolored it from within. The cloak that falls from the figure's shoulders is stiff, the fabric saturated with ash and dried gore, the original patterns invisible. The junior custodian cannot lift his gaze to the helm, yet he knows, in the way dreams make knowledge a physical thing, that the face behind that mask is not the emperor's. It is someone else, someone he should name, but cannot. Every time he tries, the name unravels, turning into smoke in his mouth. The figure places a hand on his head. The weight is unbearable, not physically. The gauntlet rests lightly, the pressure no greater than a comrade's. Touch. It is the psychic weight that crushes him. His vision goes black. Then, like a lens orienting, it clears to show a different landscape entirely. He sees Unification-era terror. He smells chem weapons on the wind, the acrid sting of ozone, the reek of burned flesh. He sees plains of glassed sand where cities once stood. He sees the Emperor walking across a battlefield, his cloak streaming behind him, his eyes hard and bright. He sees Valdor at his side, armor unblemished, spear unsullied. The vision jumps. He sees the siege, walls broken, skies on fire, blood on marble. The Emperor fallen, carried in a trail of red and light. Valdor walking alone through a hall choked with corpses. The throne swallowing a god. The vision jumps again. He sees the throne hall empty, but for one figure. The same figure from the dream. Armor, not the clean gold of the early days, but the stained, yellowed plate. Cloak heavy. Spear planted point down, its blade dark. The light in the hall is not bright. It is the color of old bruises. Through it all, the pressure of the hand on his head does not ease. When he wakes, every time, he finds himself on the floor of his cell, armor still locked, helmet sealed. The inside of the helm is smeared with blood, where he has raked at his own face, fingernails clawing through skin in a desperate attempt to get the unseen weight off him. His eyes are red with burst vessels. His throat is raw from voiceless screaming. He asks the chirurgeon for a purge. Drugs, perhaps. Hypnosuggestion. Anything to quieten the dreams. The chirurgeon writes that he refused, not because he could not, but because something in him knew that these dreams were not simple sickness. He notes, in a shaky postscript, that he reported none of this to his superiors. He did not want to see what might happen if the 10,000 decided that one of their own had glimpsed a truth best left unspoken. Both of these pieces, the Vault Massacre and the Dreaming Custodian, contain a voice. In the audio from the Vault, in the remembered phrases from the dream, there are turns of speech that match older records so closely that chance becomes an unsatisfactory explanation. Valdor's own words are rare in the accessible archives. When remembrancers caught him speaking, they tended to gild his phrases, smoothing them into something more poetic than they perhaps were. Even with that filter, certain patterns emerge. He speaks sparingly, favoring short sentences, heavy with unadorned meaning. He calls the Emperor my master in contexts where other commanders say my lord or the master of mankind. When referring to his own duty, he uses the phrase I stand where he cannot, or variations thereof. In the Unification campaign logs, When asked why the custodes were on a particular field instead of the emperor, he is recorded as answering, "He has greater theatres on which to spend his presence. I stand where he cannot. Master cannot, and nothing will pass. Master cannot, and nothing will pass." These lines are quoted in different sources, at different times, with enough consistency in phrasing to suggest they are not inventions. The voice in the vault says, "He stands where his master cannot." The dreaming custodian hears, in one vision, the yellow armored figure murmur, "I stand where my master cannot," as he looks up at the throne. Such linguistic fingerprints are harder to fake than mere imagery. A demon mimicking a form can don a man's face, his armor, his manner. To mirror his habitual phrasings, his choice of pronouns, the rhythm of his replies, requires either intimate knowledge or something deeper. In a universe where the warp laps at every thought, identity is not a neat, singular spark. It is a pattern of behaviors, memories, phrases, obsessions. Think of it as a song. Each person's song is different. When they live, their bodies are the instruments through which the song is played. When they die, the song does not necessarily cease. In the best of cases, it fades gently, its echoes blending with the background noise of the immaterium. In the worst of cases, it catches on the fabric of reality, repeats, grows louder, becomes something monstrous. Valdor stood for centuries at the loudest point in the galaxy. The Golden Throne is a hole torn between realms. All the songs of the psychers fed into it. All the prayers, all the screams, all the vows whirl there. For a being to stand day after day in that storm, his own song does not remain unaffected. It is amplified, distorted, reverberated. His duty, his phrase, "I stand where my master cannot," becomes less a personal oath and more a psychic motif, a pattern in the warp inextricably tied to the palace and to what sits upon that gilded torment engine. It is not difficult to imagine that over time, the man and the motif cease to be distinct. What then does it mean for the Imperium if the Yellow King is indeed that motif given form? If the most loyal guardian the Emperor ever wielded has been dragged through duty and proximity into something half human and half symbol? The foundations of our faith rely on certain stones being solid: the throne, the Emperor's will, however interpreted, the custodes, unbending, incorruptible. If the regent's song has been warped into a thing that can tear an inquisitor's retinue apart in a sub-level vault while reciting archaic litanies, if it can grip a junior custodian's mind and drag him through the worst memories of our species, then that bedrock is not what we thought. The Empire becomes again what it has always secretly been, a collection of masks worn over wounds. This, perhaps more than the horror of the deeds themselves, is why these ideas are suppressed so ruthlessly. Heresies that elevate the Emperor to yet greater heights of divinity are tolerated, even quietly encouraged, as long as they do not upset the tithes. Heresies that suggest the Emperor is weak are burned out with fire and blade, but a heresy that says his servants have become something unnameable in his shadow, that the very mechanisms that keep the Imperium from collapsing have curdled into monsters, strikes at the foundation stones themselves. The 41st millennium's great strength, if strength it can be called, lies in how it bludgeons truth into myth until the edges blur. Tales are told and retold until the original events are buried. Dates slip, names shift. What remains is not fact, but resonance. Does it matter then whether Constantin Valdor literally became the Yellow King, or whether the Yellow King is a best-fit myth we have conjured to explain all the silences, all the sudden, unaccountable judgments, all the dreams of sickly gold? The convergence of these patterns, this heresy, gives shape to terror. It tells us that the gaps in our histories are not empty. They are occupied by a figure whose loyalty is unquestioned, whose sanity is not, who stands between us and the final collapse with a spear in hand and jaundiced light bathing his armor. You may accuse me of confirmation bias, of seeing the Yellow King in every shadow because I have convinced myself he is there. There are counter-arguments, and they deserve airing. Perhaps the King in Yellow is a chaos echo, a construct born of combined fear, a warp-born meme that has seized upon the imagery of custodies and palaces because those are the strongest cultural symbols available. Perhaps the heretical texts are the work of one original madman, copied and elaborated upon by others until an archetype solidified. It would not be the first time the immaterium has fed back to us a grotesque caricature of our own ideals. It is also possible that I have been fooled by deliberate propaganda. That some faction within the Imperium, desiring to undermine trust in the custodes or to frighten rivals away from certain lines of inquiry, has seeded these stories where men like me are guaranteed to find them. They might well be laughing at the thought of an old inquisitor hunched over his desk, drawing connections between things that never touched. Some of the evidence I have presented may indeed be coincidence, phrases repeated because they sound right, imagery borrowed unconsciously from half-remembered dramas, dreams shaped by childhood indoctrination rather than by any external presence. In an empire as vast and old as ours, patterns can emerge from random scattering. I have not been immune to doubt. There is one last piece I must add, though it costs me. You will have noted that throughout these pages I have alluded to my own obsession with the Librum Aurum. I found it in a sealed vault, read it despite every instinct, and watched as its words gnawed at the corners of my sanity. Until now I have been, perhaps, too scholarly in my descriptions of that encounter, cloaking it in analysis to keep its true weight at bay. There was a moment, as I pored over the final scene of that unburnable play, when the vault around me ceased to be simply a room. The lumen globe above my head fizzed, then dimmed to a flat yellow. The dust motes hanging in the air blazed like flecks of diseased gold. The shadows between the shelves deepened beyond what simple geometry could allow. I tasted copper and incense. My nose began to bleed, a slow trickle that ran over my lip and pattered onto the parchment. I smelt blood and ozone. Between the stacks, at the far edge of my vision, something tall and narrow moved. I did not see its details. I saw the suggestion of a cloak, the line of a shoulder, the glimmer of metal worn too long in one place. It did not advance. It did not threaten. It simply stood, and the weight of its attention pressed down on me like a gauntlet upon a bowed head. I do not remember collapsing. When I woke, hours had gone. The lumen burned cold and white once more. The dust lay as it had before, dull and grey. My nose had dried. Pages were scattered around me, some torn, some twisted, as if caught in a gust that had never been recorded on any instrument. The reader's skull lay on its side, its oculars dark. On the parchment before me, in my own hand, a line had been scrawled. I stand where my master cannot. I do not remember writing it. You may say that I had primed myself, that my mind, saturated with that phrase, with that idea, scratched it out as a release valve. It is the most rational explanation. It is also, perhaps, the least satisfying. For in that moment, as I stared at the words and felt their weight settle into the pit of my gut, I knew with a clarity that has never since left me that I had been seen. So we arrive at the end. Is Constantin Valdor the king in yellow? Has the emperor's golden executioner been warped by centuries at his side into a figure of jaundiced horror, a regent without a name who haunts the palace and appears in the dreams of those who stray too close? Or is the Yellow King a myth built from echoes and gaps, a mask we have crafted to wear over the wound of our ignorance? In practical terms, the distinction may be meaningless. The pattern fits. It fits the era of ruin, with its half-ruined eagles and its wandering angels. It fits the Librum Aurum, with its nameless monarch in rotted gold. It fits the scouring, with its invisible custodial hand on the scales. It fits the later fragments, the vault massacre, the custodian's dream, the whispered line that echoes down the centuries. Whether that pattern has at its center a single tortured being or a conglomerate of fears, it tells us something true about the Imperium, that our bedrock is not as firm as the catechisms insist, that even the most loyal can be twisted by duty into something terrible, that we will do anything, even murder the memory of our greatest servants, rather than look directly at what we have become. You may choose your heresy. Would you rather that Valdor died cleanly, perhaps in some unrecorded action, his body entombed and his name scrubbed for reasons of state? That the King in Yellow is a mere demon in a familiar mask, an enemy like any other, to be catalogued and burned? Or would you accept that somewhere in the palace's depths, in halls lit by sickly gold, a figure still stands, armor cracked and smoke-stained, spear in hand, ruling in all but name because no one else can or will? Which is worse? I know where my own nightmares fall. When I close my eyes, I see the throne chamber from a vantage point no living man can claim. From above, as if my soul hangs in the vault like a forgotten censer. The hall stretches out in terrible symmetry, its walls a forest of pipes and cables, its floor a mosaic of skulls and saints. At the far end, the throne looms, a mountain of metal and bone and machinery, its occupant barely visible beneath the web of tubes and restraints. The light that pours from it is not pure gold. It is jaundiced, the color of old bruises, of parchment left too long in damp. It washes over the chamber, washing the frescoes, the banners, the ranked statues in a flat, sickly hue. It pools in the hollows of carved faces, turns eyes into pits. Beneath that light, tiny as a single cell in the body of the hall, stands a figure. His armor was once resplendent, auramite burnished to a mirror sheen. Now it is cracked, smoke-stained, patches of the metal gone dull and yellowed, as if the rot that touches all things in this age has found even that venerable plate. His cloak hangs in heavy folds, its edges hardened by layers of ash and blood. His spear leans against his shoulder, the blade catching the jaundiced glow and throwing it back in pale fire. He does not move. He does not need to. The crown of the Imperium is not a band of metal on a brow. It is the weight of duty that never ends, hammered into a man until he is no longer truly a man at all. It rests not on the Emperor's ruined head, but on the narrow slope of the shoulders that stand before him, bearing up the world, because there is no one else left to do it. In that light, in that hall, the King in Yellow stands where his master cannot, and we, trembling in the half-darkness beyond the palace walls, are ruled by a ghost in cracked gold.